and metal bars were reportedly used with deadly consequences.
If there is retaliation from either side, this could lead to a limited local war.
Each side has blamed the other, with an Indian Army statement saying a violent face-off happened as a result of an attempt by the Chinese side to unilaterally change the status quo.
The Indian troops crossed the border illegally twice and carried out provocative attacks on Chinese personnel.
New Delhi has previously tried to downplay escalating tensions, labelling images on social media as unauthenticated, while China has been releasing its own propaganda showing a huge army amassing near the border.
So here's the new...
Australian researcher Nathan Rusa has been monitoring satellite imagery and says Chinese forces had set up positions to overlook the Indians.
Previously, the forces were multiple kilometres apart, and now they're within a few hundred metres of each other.
Whether they want to evict the Chinese by violence, whether they believe they can resolve this through talks, that is something we'll see in the days to come.
James Oaten, ABC News.
The US President Donald Trump has signed an executive order introducing reforms to curb police brutality, but his political rivals say it's not enough. In the latest protest violence, an activist was shot and wounded in Albuquerque when protesters clashed with right-wing militia who tried to stop them tearing down a statue. Chief Foreign Correspondent Philip Williams reports.
The activists were intent on toppling a statue of a 16th century Spanish conquistador. But a heavily armed self-styled militia group turned up, equally determined it should stay put.
Can you please step down?
Scuffles broke out. One of the militia was chased down the road. He fired a shot, critically injuring a man who'd hit him over the head with a skateboard. The 31-year-old shooter was arrested by police.
We're going to continue to seek the strongest possible prosecution and justice in this matter.
In Washington, the president was signing an executive order aimed at curbing police racism, a national database to keep track on poor police behaviour, attaching mental health professionals to police stations and new controls on chokeholds.
Chokeholds will be banned, except if an officer's life is at risk.
President Trump was talking up the economy, predicting it would be booming by 2021, and he was confident a vaccine against COVID-19 would be available later this year.
We're making tremendous progress. I deal with these incredible scientists, doctors, very, very closely. I have great respect for their minds, and they have come up with things, and they've come up with the AIDS vaccine.
Except there is no AIDS vaccination. Everyone, including the protesters, hoping the president has got it right on coronavirus. The protesters show no signs of backing down. The president is back on the hustings very shortly. The politics of division as sharp as ever. Throw in COVID-19 and it's a toxic mix ahead. Philip Williams, ABC News, Los Angeles.
A US power company has pleaded guilty to the death of 84 people in a California bushfire 2 years ago. Pacific Gas and Electric has admitted it caused the 2018 blaze, which was ignited by its electrical grid. The bushfire nearly wiped out the entire town of Paradise and drove the company into bankruptcy last year. It's the deadliest corporate crime ever successfully prosecuted in the United States. To finance, the local share market managed another rise today after strong gains in New York last night. Here's Alan Kohler.
Today's reason for market optimism was last night's revelation that American retail sales jumped 17.7% in May, the biggest monthly rise in history, following the 14.7% fall in April. So maybe it'll be a V-shaped recovery after all, thought investors. Here's a chart of US retail sales, and as you can see, there's still a fair way to go for the V to be completed and for sales to get back to where they were. But it was definitely a big improvement, and it does suggest that American consumers are bouncing back. So the US stock market bounced last night, nearly 2%, the third rise in a row. The Australian market followed suit today, and some of the bigger gains included A2 Milk, car sales, Vicinity Centres and Beacon Lighting, up more than 20% after an upbeat update. BHP was a rare fall after news that Chief Financial Officer Peter Bevan has quit to pursue his own personal ambitions, as the announcement put it. To replace him, they've hired CSL's top bean counter, David Lamont. ANZ Bank's Economics Department has revised their forecast for the Australian economy upwards. Instead of a decline of 4.7% in GDP this year, they're now forecasting -2% because the shutdown response was not as extensive as they expected, the health outcomes were much better, and the fiscal response has been material. Here's what they think quarterly GDP will now look like on this chart here, and it's not quite a V, is it? The Australian dollar took a tumble overnight, down to 68.5 US cents, but it got back to 69 today. And all the commodities went up, especially oil and base metals. And that's finance.
Now time for the weather with Graham Creed.
We've got another burst of cold air set to move through the southwest of Western Australia. Still some showers and thunderstorms, but they will gradually contract south as we move through the day. This high will keep most of the southeast clear, but it's still bringing an onshore wind flow along parts of the New South Wales and Queensland coast, and that will result in a few more showers. So for Queensland, it really is the southeast coast and also the northeast most likely to see widespread showers. Across the more central parts, they will be fairly patchy and more coastal than pushing further inland. For New South Wales, we could see an isolated clearing shower along the coast of the Hunter, far more likely about the mid-north coast and northern rivers, and gradually contracting north through the day. A dry day across Victoria, we should see some fairly widespread frost, particularly around Gippsland, where there is a frost warning current. We've also got some increasing winds about the more western districts. We'll also see widespread frost as road weather alert for icy conditions in Tasmania. An isolated shower about the north coast, mostly about the western tiers. For South Australia, also a generally dry day. Winds will start to strengthen as we move into the afternoon. Some late showers about the Nullarbor, but it should remain dry elsewhere. We've got plenty of showers across the Southwest Land Division and neighbouring areas in Western Australia. They will gradually contract further south with the thunderstorms easing. And apart from an isolated shower about the northeast of the Territory, it should be clear, dry and mostly sunny.
You can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on iView. Here are the top stories on ABC News. The federal takeover of the Victorian ALP may be heading to court. The ABC understands some unions are considering taking legal action against the Premier Daniel Andrews. They're unhappy with his support of the National Executive's intervention in the state branch and the suspension of voting rights for members until 2023. Police have made at least 2 arrests during a Black Lives Matter protest in Brisbane. About 200 people who'd marched from King George Square blocked the Alice Street on-ramp outside Parliament House earlier this afternoon. Police secured the gates to the parliamentary precinct and moved the crowd on. The Catholic Church has asked priests who've been receiving JobKeeper payments to donate almost half the money to the church. ABC Investigations has obtained letters sent to priests in the Parramatta Diocese in Western Sydney, which ask them to help make up for a plunge in donations because of the coronavirus pandemic. And a Galapagos giant tortoise has been retired to its home island. The reptile is credited with saving the species after fathering 800 offspring over 5 decades. The successful breeding program has seen the population now total 2,000 tortoises. The topic of cancel culture has been much discussed in recent weeks after calls to remove statues of historical figures from public places, as well as streaming platforms removing contentious TV episodes and films from their catalogues. The conversation has been sparked by the global Black Lives Matter protests. For more, I'm joined by James Allen, who's the Garrick Professor in Law at the University of Queensland. James Allen, thanks for your time tonight. You've written an opinion piece about cancel culture. The opening line really struck me. It says, "You know you're living in George Orwell's world when speech is considered violence and actual violence is considered speech." How did we get to this point?
Well, I don't really know how we got to this point. It's quite depressing. Certainly when I went to university in Canada in the 1980s, you expected to run across opinions you didn't agree with, and you didn't expect to shut them up so they could never speak again. And so I feel like I'm living in a world now where, you know, there's a lot of delicate wallflowers, and if they don't like something someone else is saying, they just don't want that view to exist in the public square, and it's a terrible state of affairs we're in. I think there's a lot of cowardice amongst the sort of elites, the corporate elites. They come under a little pressure, and people have been fired in the United States for saying all lives matter. It's probably insensitive, but it doesn't look like a firing offense to me. New York Times editor fired for running an opinion piece by a U.S. senator, Tom Cotton from Arkansas. Somebody ran a piece in the Philadelphia Inquirer on buildings matter too. The normal response 30 years ago was, I don't like your view, and here's why you're wrong. The response today is, you're not allowed to express that view anywhere in public, and we're going to try to get you fired. We're going to take away your advertising if we can. We're going to take you off Twitter. The social media companies are terrible. I won't be surprised if they're either broken up in a sort of or they're made into sort of quasi-utilities in the U.S. so that First Amendment jurisprudence applies to them, because right now they're just taking too many views offline.
We'll come to social media in a moment, because I think that's really important to discuss here. But you mentioned universities. Many of the people taking part in the protests and speaking out against racism are young people. So are universities playing a role here?
Well, first your watchers should know that I'm part of the sort of 4% of university professors who are on the right side of politics. So I'm conservative, and there aren't very many of us, I can tell you that. I don't mind young people protesting, that's pretty good, but a lot of these protests have turned pretty violent. I don't like when statutes are toppled. There's processes for getting rid of statues. If you don't like it, go through the process. If you topple them, my own view is to put the statue back up and then build another one. So there's two of them, because I think any sign of weakness and this sort of mob mentality grows. So if somebody wants to go through the normal process of, trying to get a local body to take down a statue, I don't like that, but at least that's, operating according to law. If you do it by a mob and take it down, I would just put it back up, and I'd put 2 or 3 other ones up of the same person. That you just cannot let that sort of, you can't be weak in the face of that kind of what I would call unlawful behavior. So I'm all for protest. I'm probably the most pro-free speech law professor in the country. There isn't much speech I would stop, some, but not much. But when it turns to actual violence, it just has to be dealt with immediately, I think.
Do these conversations around cancel culture and the pulling down of statues and people being offended detract from the cause of these movements, which started out about police brutality and, in Australia, Indigenous deaths in custody and incarceration rates?
Well, it's not easy to actually get at the heart of it. The police officer in Minnesota who was kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck